August 15th, 1945. Precisely at noon, across the Japanese archipelago, millions of people stopped whatever they were doing and gathered around their radios. In factories, offices, homes, and public squares, an entire nation held its collective breath. They were about to hear something unprecedented in Japanese history. For the first time in over 2,000 years of imperial rule, their emperor would speak directly to them. Not through proclamations read by ministers, not through ceremonial announcements, but his actual voice transmitted through crackling radio waves into their homes. Most had never heard Emperor Hirohito speak. To them, he was a divine figure, a living god whose voice was considered too sacred for common ears, yet here they were, waiting to listen to words that would change everything they understood about their world, their war, and their future. What they didn't know was that just hours earlier, Japanese military officers had stormed the imperial palace in a desperate attempt to prevent this very moment from happening. Armed soldiers had searched frantically through corridors and offices, threatening palace staff, demanding to know where the emperor's recorded message was hidden. They were willing to kill to stop these words from reaching the Japanese people. They failed, but barely. The recording they were trying to destroy contained 15 minutes of classical Japanese that would end the most devastating war in human history. But the path to this moment had been paved with miscalculations, desperate gambles, and a series of catastrophic events that made surrender inevitable, yet nearly impossible to achieve. 3 days earlier, on August 12th, Emperor Hirohito had made a decision that contradicted everything his military commanders believed about honor, sacrifice, and the divine nature of Imperial Japan. He decided the war must end. Not through negotiation, not through conditional surrender, but through complete capitulation to Allied demands. This decision would trigger the most dangerous 48 hours in modern Japanese history. The emperor's choice came after receiving reports that defied comprehension. 2 cities had been erased from existence by weapons that seemed to harness the power of the sun itself. Hiroshima on August 6th had been vaporized by a single bomb. The blast had killed 80,000 people instantly and left shadows of human figures burned into stone walls. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. But even these unprecedented attacks weren't the decisive factor. On August 8th, the Soviet Union had shattered Japan's last desperate hope. For months, Japanese diplomats had been secretly negotiating with Stalin, begging the Soviets to mediate peace terms with America and Britain. Japan was willing to give up most of its conquered territories, pay massive reparations, even accept foreign occupation of some home islands. Anything except unconditional surrender and the potential elimination of the emperor system. The Soviets had been playing a calculated game. They listened to Japanese proposals while simultaneously preparing the largest military operation in Asian history. On August 9th, 1.5 million Soviet troops smashed across the Manchurian border, destroying Japan's Kwantung Army in a matter of hours. The attack was so overwhelming that Japanese commanders couldn't even organize coherent resistance. Entire divisions simply vanished from radio contact. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of Japan's entire strategic position. The Soviet invasion meant no negotiated peace was possible. Stalin wasn't interested in mediation. He wanted territory, and he was taking it by force. Japan now faced enemies on every front with no hope of diplomatic escape. The emperor received these reports in his underground bunker beneath the imperial palace. The massive concrete structure had been built to protect the imperial family from American bombing raids, but no amount of reinforced concrete could shield them from the reality of these intelligence summaries. Japan's position was mathematically hopeless. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria, supposedly Japan's most elite fighting force, had been destroyed in 36 hours. The home islands had virtually no air defense remaining. American submarines controlled every shipping lane. The atomic bombs demonstrated that the United States could destroy Japanese cities at will, without risking a single American soldier. Most critically, Japan's ability to feed its population was collapsing. American submarine warfare had reduced food imports to starvation levels. The rice harvest was failing due to lack of fertilizer and farm equipment. Intelligence estimates suggested that without immediate peace, millions of Japanese civilians would die of hunger before American invasion forces even landed. Emperor Hirohito understood numbers that his military commanders refused to acknowledge. Continuing the war wouldn't demonstrate Japanese courage or honor. It would result in the extinction of the Japanese people as a functioning society. The choice wasn't between surrender and victory, the choice was between surrender and national suicide. But making this decision and implementing it were entirely different challenges. The emperor had no legal authority to end the war unilaterally. That power belonged to the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, known as the Big Six. These 6 men, military and civilian leaders, had been debating surrender terms for weeks while Japan's cities burned around them. 3 members of the council supported accepting the Potsdam Declaration, the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. 3 members opposed it absolutely, preferring national destruction to the humiliation of defeat. The deadlock was complete, and Japanese constitutional law provided no mechanism for breaking it. Under normal circumstances, the emperor would never intervene directly in government decisions. His role was ceremonial, symbolic, spiritual. He reigned but did not rule. Active political involvement would violate centuries of constitutional tradition and potentially undermine the entire imperial system. Yet these weren't normal circumstances. With the council deadlocked and the nation facing extinction, Hirohito chose to break with precedent. On August 10th, he informed Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki that he favoured accepting the Potsdam Declaration immediately, with only one condition. The emperor system must be preserved. This intervention created a new crisis. If the emperor's preference became known to military hardliners, they might attempt to remove him from power or declare him mentally incompetent. Several army officers were already whispering that the emperor had been influenced by weak advisors who didn't understand the true spirit of Japan. The government crafted a careful response to the Allies. Japan would accept unconditional surrender provided that the emperor's status as sovereign ruler remained unchanged. This wasn't really unconditional surrender, but Japanese leaders hoped the Allies might accept this face-saving compromise. The American response arrived on August the 12th and was devastating in its precision. The Allies would accept Japan's surrender, but the emperor's authority would be subject to the Supreme Allied Commander. The emperor could remain as a figurehead, but real power would belong to American occupation forces. To Japanese leaders, this was almost worse than abolishing the emperor entirely. It reduced the divine ruler to a puppet, stripping away the mystical authority that formed the foundation of Japanese political legitimacy. Many military officers declared they would rather die fighting than accept such humiliation. The debate within the Big Six became increasingly desperate. Time was running out. Every day of delay meant more cities destroyed, more Soviet territory conquered, more Japanese civilians dead. Yet the council remained paralyzed by the same fundamental split: honor versus survival, tradition versus reality. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito called for another imperial conference. This time, he wouldn't simply express his preference. He would make a direct decision that would end the war regardless of military opposition. But first, that decision had to be recorded and transmitted to the Japanese people. And there were men with guns who were determined to prevent that transmission from ever happening. The recording session was scheduled for late that evening, in a bunker deep beneath the imperial palace. The emperor would speak for 15 minutes in classical Japanese, explaining to his subjects why their divine ruler was choosing surrender over destruction. But between the recording and the broadcast lay 12 hours during which anything could happen. The technical arrangements for the recording session revealed just how dangerous the situation had become. NHK radio technicians arrived at the imperial palace under heavy guard, carrying their equipment through corridors patrolled by soldiers whose loyalty was increasingly uncertain. The recording would take place in a concrete bunker beneath the Imperial Household Ministry, a location chosen specifically because it could be defended if military rebels attempted to storm the palace. At 11:25 p.m. on August 14th, Emperor Hirohito entered the makeshift recording studio. The room was cramped, poorly ventilated, and filled with unfamiliar technical equipment. Microphones had been positioned carefully to capture his voice, but the emperor had never spoken into a recording device before. His entire life had been governed by ancient protocols that never anticipated radio broadcasts or phonograph records. The emperor carried a handwritten speech, 15 minutes of classical Japanese that had been crafted over several days of intense consultation with his closest advisors. Every word had been chosen with extraordinary care, not just for its meaning but for its political implications. The speech had to end the war without triggering a military revolt, acknowledge defeat without destroying national morale, and preserve imperial dignity while accepting humiliating surrender terms. As Hirohito began reading, palace officials noticed his voice trembling slightly. This wasn't nervousness about public speaking. The emperor understood that he was violating fundamental principles of imperial behavior that had governed Japan for over a millennium. Never before had an emperor spoken directly to common people. Never before had imperial authority been used to contradict military leadership so dramatically. The recording process itself was fraught with technical difficulties. The emperor's voice was naturally quiet, and the classical Japanese he was using contained pronunciations that would be difficult for ordinary citizens to understand. Sound engineers struggled to adjust levels while maintaining respectful distance from the divine presence. Any technical failure could provide military hardliners with justification for claiming the recording was flawed and should be remade. Meanwhile, throughout Tokyo and other major cities, rumours were spreading that something unprecedented was about to happen. Military police reported unusual activity among army units stationed near the capital. Radio operators noticed increased encrypted communications between different command centres. Intelligence officers detected signs that some military leaders were preparing for emergency action. The most dangerous development was occurring within the Imperial Guard itself. These elite soldiers, responsible for protecting the emperor and the palace grounds, were deeply divided about their duties. Some believed their obligation was to protect the emperor's person, regardless of his decisions. Others felt their true loyalty was to the spiritual essence of imperial, Japan, which they believed the emperor was betraying through surrender. Major Kenji Hatanaka had spent the entire day building support for direct action to prevent the surrender broadcast. A career military officer who had served in China and the Philippines, Hatanaka represented the mindset that had driven Japan into war and now refused to accept defeat. He believed that the emperor was being manipulated by weak advisors who didn't understand the true spirit of Bushido. Hatanaka's plan was audacious and desperate. He would lead a group of loyal officers to seize control of the imperial palace, capture or eliminate government officials who supported surrender, locate and destroy the emperor's recorded message, and prevent any surrender announcement from reaching the Japanese people. If successful, the coup would allow Japan to continue fighting until every last soldier and civilian had died in defense of the homeland. The conspiracy involved dozens of officers from different military units, but their coordination was hampered by the same institutional problems that had plagued Japanese military operations throughout the war. Different branches of the military had competing command structures. Communication between units was often poor. Most critically, the conspirators had no clear plan for what would happen after they seized the palace. As midnight approached on August 14th, Hatanaka's forces began moving into position around the imperial palace. They wore standard military uniforms and carried legitimate orders that had been forged or obtained through deception. Palace guards initially assumed these were routine security reinforcements, given the tense political situation. The rebels' first objective was to locate the emperor's recorded speech before it could be broadcast. They knew the recording had been completed, but palace security had hidden the phonograph records in an undisclosed location. Without destroying those records, the coup would fail even if they successfully controlled the palace grounds. At 1 a.m. on August 15th, the rebels began searching the imperial palace systematically. They interrogated staff members, threatened violence against anyone who wouldn't cooperate, and ransacked offices looking for the hidden recordings. The palace was enormous, with hundreds of rooms, multiple underground levels, and complex security protocols that even some staff members didn't fully understand. The search became increasingly frantic as hours passed without success. Palace officials had anticipated exactly this type of threat and had prepared multiple hiding places for the recordings. The actual phonograph records were concealed in a stack of routine administrative documents, camouflaged among thousands of similar files that would take days to examine individually. Meanwhile, loyal palace guards and government security forces were organizing resistance to the coup attempt. General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, had been alerted to the rebellion and was mobilizing troops to retake the palace. But Tanaka faced his own loyalty crisis. Many of his soldiers sympathized with the rebels' objectives, even if they disagreed with their methods. The confusion extended beyond the palace walls. Throughout Tokyo, military units received contradictory orders from different command centers. Some commanders were told to support the coup, others were ordered to suppress it. Many officers simply barricaded their units in their barracks and waited to see which faction would emerge victorious. At NHK Broadcasting headquarters, radio technicians prepared for the scheduled noon broadcast while armed soldiers surrounded the building. The rebels had sent forces to secure the radio station, but they arrived to find it already heavily defended by troops loyal to the government. A tense standoff developed, with both sides reluctant to start shooting, but neither willing to withdraw. The technical preparations for the broadcast were extraordinarily complex. The Emperor's voice had to be transmitted simultaneously to dozens of radio stations across Japan and its remaining occupied territories. Any failure in the transmission system could provide rebels with an opportunity to claim the surrender announcement was invalid or incomplete. As dawn approached on August 15th, it became clear that the coup was failing. The rebels had spent precious hours searching unsuccessfully for the recordings, while government forces regrouped and prepared counterattacks. More critically, several key military commanders who had initially seemed sympathetic to the rebels were now distancing themselves from the conspiracy. Major Hatanaka realized his mission was hopeless. The recordings remained hidden, the radio station was beyond his reach, and government troops were converging on the palace from multiple directions. Rather than face capture and interrogation, he made a decision that reflected the same mentality that had driven Japan to war in the first place. At approximately 11 a.m. on August 15th, 1 hour before the Emperor's broadcast was scheduled to begin, Hatanaka placed his service pistol against his forehead and pulled the trigger. His final act was a death poem found in his uniform pocket, expressing regret that dark clouds had gathered over the Emperor's reign, but claiming no personal regret for his actions. The suicide marked the effective end of the coup attempt, but the danger wasn't over. Across Japan, military units were still receiving conflicting orders. Some commanders remained uncertain whether the surrender announcement would actually occur or whether it represented legitimate imperial authority. The broadcast equipment at NHK had been tested repeatedly throughout the morning, but technical failures remained a constant threat. Radio transmission in 1945, Japan relied on aging equipment that had been stressed by years of wartime use. Vacuum tubes failed without warning. Power fluctuations could distort audio quality. A single technical malfunction could render the Emperor's message unintelligible to millions of listeners. Engineers ran final checks on the phonograph system that would play the recorded speech. The Emperor's voice existed on 2 wax discs, each containing roughly 7.5 minutes of audio. The discs were fragile, susceptible to scratches, warping, or breaking entirely. Backup copies existed, but switching between recordings during a live broadcast risked creating gaps or distortions that could confuse listeners about the message's authenticity. At 11:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the scheduled broadcast, NHK announcers began reading preliminary statements across the radio network. Citizens throughout Japan were instructed to prepare for an imperial announcement of the highest importance. Factories stopped production lines. Schools gathered students in auditoriums. Government offices suspended normal operations. Even in bombed-out cities where people were struggling to find food and shelter, radio broadcasts took precedence over survival activities. The language barrier posed an additional challenge that palace officials had debated extensively during the speech's preparation. Emperor Hirohito would speak in classical Japanese, a formal dialect that differed significantly from the conversational language most citizens used daily. This wasn't merely an aesthetic choice. Imperial pronouncements had always employed classical forms to maintain appropriate dignity and distance between the divine ruler and common subjects. However, classical Japanese contained vocabulary and grammatical structures that many listeners would find difficult to comprehend immediately. Complex honorific expressions, archaic verb forms, and formal sentence patterns that were standard in imperial communications might leave ordinary citizens uncertain about the speech's actual meaning. Palace advisors had considered this problem but concluded that using informal language would be more shocking to the Japanese people than potential comprehension difficulties. The timing of the broadcast had been calculated with extraordinary precision. Noon was chosen because it maximized the number of people who could listen during their lunch breaks. Factory workers, office employees, students, and farmers could pause their activities without disrupting essential wartime production. Military units could gather around radios without interfering with defensive preparations. At exactly 12 p.m. on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan, speaking words that had nearly been silenced by bullets and rebellion. The coup had failed by a single hour. The recordings had survived hidden in a stack of papers. And with 15 minutes of classical Japanese, the voice of a living god told his people that the war was over. The most devastating conflict in human history ended not with explosions or invasions, but with a divine whisper that travelled through radio waves into millions of homes, forever changing what it meant to be Japanese.